The autumn wind swept through the quiet streets of Riverside, a modest suburb on the outskirts of Chicago, where the houses stood in neat rows like sentinels guarding ordinary lives. Maple trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves turning shades of amber and crimson, falling gently to create a carpet that crunched beneath the feet of children walking home from school. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors' names, where porch lights flickered on at dusk like clockwork, and where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. Elena Brooks walked along Oakwood Avenue with her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, her dark eyes observing the world with an intensity unusual for an 8-year-old. She had always been a quiet child, the kind who listened more than she spoke, who watched from the edges of the playground while other children played their games with carefree abandon. Her classmates sometimes asked why she seemed so serious, why she rarely smiled the way they did, but Elena never had an answer that satisfied them. She didn't know how to explain the feeling that had lived inside her chest for as long as she could remember, a sense that something important was missing, like a puzzle with a piece that had vanished before she'd even opened the box. The Brooks house sat at the corner of Oakwood and 5th Street, a 2-story structure with faded blue paint and white shutters that had seen better days. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, and the garden was a tangle of overgrown rose bushes that Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who had raised Elena, tended with arthritic hands every Sunday morning. It wasn't much, but it was home, and Elena had never known anything different. She pushed through the creaking gate and climbed the wooden steps, each one groaning under her weight. The familiar scent of lavender and old books greeted her as she opened the front door, calling out her customary greeting. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm home." The response came from the kitchen, where the sound of running water suggested dinner preparations were already underway. "In here, sweetheart. How was school?" Elena dropped her backpack by the stairs and made her way through the narrow hallway, past walls decorated with faded photographs of people she didn't recognize. Relatives, Mrs. Callahan had always said, though Elena had never met any of them. The kitchen was warm, filled with the golden light of late afternoon streaming through lace curtains. Mrs. Callahan stood at the sink, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her hands working a potato peeler with practiced efficiency. "It was fine," Elena said, the standard answer she gave every day. She pulled out a chair at the small wooden table and sat down, her legs swinging beneath her, not quite reaching the floor. "We learned about the Revolutionary War. Mrs. Patterson said we're all going to do presentations next month." Mrs. Callahan turned, a gentle smile creasing her weathered face. At 73, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body no longer cooperated as willingly as it once had. "That sounds wonderful. You've always been good at presentations. Remember the one you did about ocean animals last year? Your teacher said it was the best in the class." Elena nodded, but her mind had already drifted elsewhere. For the past few weeks, she'd been experiencing something she couldn't quite name, a restlessness that made it difficult to focus on homework or the television shows Mrs. Callahan liked to watch in the evenings. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, like the moment before jumping into deep water when you can't quite see the bottom. "Mrs. Callahan?" Elena's voice was soft, tentative. "Can I ask you something?" The elderly woman's hands paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "Of course, dear. What is it? Why don't I look like you?" The potato peeler clattered into the sink. Mrs. Callahan turned slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her pale blue eyes suddenly cautious. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Elena had been thinking about this question for months, maybe longer. She'd noticed how her classmates resembled their parents. Sarah had her mother's red hair, Marcus had his father's broad smile, Jennifer had the same green eyes as both her parents. But when Elena looked in the mirror, she saw features that had no echo in Mrs. Callahan's face. Her olive skin, her dark eyes, the way her hair fell in thick waves, none of it matched the woman who had raised her. "You have light skin and light eyes," Elena said carefully, as if testing the weight of each word. "And I don't. And you've never told me about my real parents, not really." Mrs. Callahan moved to the table and lowered herself into the chair across from Elena with a heavy sigh. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap, and for a long moment she simply looked at the child before her with an expression that Elena couldn't quite read. It was sadness mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. "Your parents couldn't take care of you, Elena. I've told you that before." "But why?" The question burst from Elena with more force than she'd intended. "Why couldn't they? Were they sick? Did they not want me?" Oh, sweetheart, no. Mrs. Callahan reached across the table to take Elena's small hand in her weathered ones. It wasn't like that. It was complicated. Grown-up complicated. They wanted you to be safe, to have a good life, away from things that weren't good for a child. Elena absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind like a stone she'd found on the beach, examining it from every angle. What kind of things? Mrs. Callahan's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. Dangerous things. Things that aren't appropriate for us to discuss. Your parents, your birth parents, they made a choice to give you a different life, a better life, and I was blessed to be the one who could give that to you. It wasn't enough. Elena had heard variations of this explanation before, and it had never satisfied the gnawing curiosity that lived inside her. But she recognized the expression on Mrs. Callahan's face, the one that meant the conversation was over, that pushing further would only cause the elderly woman distress. So she nodded, squeezed Mrs. Callahan's hand, and let the subject drop, even as the questions continued to multiply in her mind. That night, Elena lay in her small bedroom on the second floor, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the streetlight outside created shifting patterns. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood settling, and the distant hum of traffic on the main road several blocks away. Mrs. Callahan had gone to bed hours ago, her soft snoring audible through the thin walls. Elena couldn't sleep. The conversation from earlier had awakened something restless inside her, a determination that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent 8 years accepting the vague explanations, the deflected questions, the sense that her history was a locked room to which she had no key. But something had shifted today. She was tired of not knowing. She was tired of feeling like a stranger in her own life. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and padded across the worn carpet to her bedroom door. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the nightlight Mrs. Callahan kept plugged in near the bathroom. Elena moved with the practiced stealth of a child who had learned to navigate the house's creaky floorboards, avoiding the spots that would announce her movements. The attic access was a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, just outside Mrs. Callahan's bedroom. Elena had been up there only a handful of times, usually when Mrs. Callahan needed something retrieved from storage. It was a cramped, dusty space filled with boxes and old furniture, the kind of place where forgotten things accumulated over decades. Elena reached up and pulled the cord, wincing as the ladder descended with a metallic groan that seemed deafening in the silent house. She froze, listening for any sign that she'd woken Mrs. Callahan, but the snoring continued uninterrupted. Carefully, she climbed the narrow ladder, each step testing her courage. The attic smelled of old wood and mothballs. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, which Elena pulled on with a string, flooding the space with harsh yellow light. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled in Mrs. Callahan's careful handwriting. Christmas decorations, winter clothes, books. Elena moved between them, not entirely sure what she was looking for, guided only by instinct and the hope that somewhere in this accumulation of years, there might be answers. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a broken rocking chair, she found a box that was different from the others. It was smaller, made of dark wood rather than cardboard, with a tarnished brass latch. Unlike the other containers, this one bore no label. Elena knelt beside it, her heart hammering in her chest as she worked the latch open. It resisted at first, stiff from disuse, but eventually gave way with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were items that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. First, she lifted out a photograph in a silver frame. The image showed a man and a woman, both young, both beautiful. The man had dark hair and intense eyes, dressed in an expensive-looking suit. The woman wore an elegant dress, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, her smile radiant. They stood in front of what appeared to be a grand estate, the kind of house Elena had only seen in movies. She turned the frame over. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 2 words, "Before everything." With trembling fingers, Elena reached back into the box and pulled out a gold necklace with a pendant, an ornate crest featuring an eagle with spread wings, its talons gripping a shield divided into 4 quadrants. The metalwork was intricate, clearly expensive, and even in the dim attic light, it gleamed with a quality that spoke of wealth and significance. There were other items, a birth certificate with the name Elena Vescari, and a birth date that matched her own, but listing parents she'd never heard of, Michael Vescari and Isabella Vescari. A sealed envelope with, "For Elena, when she's old enough," written on the front in the same handwriting from the photograph. And tucked at the bottom, a newspaper clipping, the paper brittle and yellowing, with a headline that made Elena's stomach twist. "Viscari family under federal investigation. Allegations mount against alleged crime organization." Elena sat back on her heels, the necklace clutched in one hand, the photograph in the other, trying to make sense of what she'd discovered. Viscari. That was a name she'd never heard before. Yet according to the birth certificate, it was her name, not Brooks. Viscari. And these people in the photograph, were they her parents? The man with the powerful presence and the pregnant woman with the gentle smile? She looked again at the newspaper clipping, squinting to read the small print in the attic's inadequate light. The article was dated 8 years ago, just months before her birth. It detailed allegations against a family organization, mentions of federal investigations, terms like racketeering and organized crime, that Elena didn't fully understand but knew weren't good things. Her hands shook as she carefully placed everything back in the box except for the necklace and the photograph. These she kept, holding them close to her chest as she turned off the attic light and descended the ladder, pushing it back up into the ceiling as quietly as she could manage. Back in her room, Elena placed the photograph on her nightstand and fastened the necklace around her neck. The pendant was heavy against her chest, a tangible weight that seemed to anchor her to something she'd never known existed. She lay in bed, staring at the faces of the people who might be her parents, feeling the world she'd known for 8 years beginning to crack and shift around her. Sleep was impossible. Questions cascaded through her mind in an endless stream. Who was Michael Viscari? Who was Isabella? Why had they given her away? What were the dangerous things Mrs. Callahan had mentioned? And most urgently, were they still alive? Could she find them? The next morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through her curtains. Elena had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, her dreams filled with faceless figures and locked doors. She dressed for school mechanically, hiding the necklace beneath her shirt where it rested against her skin like a secret heartbeat. Mrs. Callahan was already in the kitchen when Elena came downstairs, preparing oatmeal with sliced bananas the way she did every weekday morning. "Good morning, sweetheart. You look tired. Didn't you sleep well?" "I'm fine," Elena lied, sliding into her usual chair. She watched Mrs. Callahan's movements, seeing the woman with new eyes. How much did she know? Was she part of whatever had caused Elena's parents to give her up? The questions burned on her tongue, but she swallowed them down, instinctively understanding that revealing what she'd found would only make things more complicated. School that day was torture. Elena sat through her classes in a fog, unable to focus on mathematics or spelling or the Revolutionary War presentation they were supposed to be planning. Her mind kept returning to the photograph, the necklace hidden beneath her shirt, the name Viscari that belonged to her but felt foreign and strange. During lunch, while her classmates chattered about weekend plans and upcoming Halloween costumes, Elena slipped away to the school library. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, was helping a group of 6th graders with a research project and barely noticed when Elena sat down at one of the public computers in the corner. Elena had used computers before. They had them in the classroom for educational games and typing practice, but she'd never used one for real research. Her fingers felt clumsy on the keyboard as she opened the internet browser and stared at the search bar, her heart pounding. She typed slowly, carefully, "Michael Viscari." The results that appeared made her breath catch. Page after page of news articles, some recent, some dating back years. Headlines screamed words like trial, charges, organized crime family, federal prosecution. Elena clicked on the most recent article, dated just 2 weeks ago. Viscari trial enters final phase. Prosecution presents closing arguments in landmark case. The article was long and filled with terms Elena didn't fully understand, but she read it anyway, absorbing what she could. Michael Viscari was on trial in Chicago, the very city just miles from where she sat. He was accused of leading what the article called one of the most powerful crime families in the Midwest. The trial had been going on for months, and a verdict was expected within weeks. There was a photograph accompanying the article, a man in handcuffs being led into a courthouse surrounded by lawyers and security. Elena leaned closer to the screen, studying his face. He was older than the man in the photograph she'd found. His hair touched with gray at the temples, his face harder, more weathered, but the eyes were the same, intense, unyielding, the same eyes she saw when she looked in the mirror. Elena's hands trembled as she clicked through more articles, piecing together a story that was both fascinating and horrifying. Michael Viscari had allegedly built a vast organization over decades, involved in activities the articles described in vague terms that still conveyed their seriousness. The trial was being called one of the most significant prosecutions in years. If convicted, he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. And nowhere, in any of the articles Elena read, was there any mention of a daughter. "Elena? Sweetie, are you okay?" She jumped, quickly closing the browser as Mrs. Henderson approached with a concerned expression. "Lunch period is almost over. You haven't even eaten your sandwich." Elena grabbed her lunch bag from beside the computer, her face flushing. "Sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I was just looking something up for a project." The librarian smiled kindly. "Well, don't forget to eat. Growing girls need their nutrition." The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Elena moved through her classes like a ghost, her mind thousands of miles away even as her body sat at her desk, raised her hand when called upon, packed up her belongings when the final bell rang. She walked home alone, as always. But today the familiar streets of Riverside felt different, like a stage set that might be struck at any moment to reveal something entirely different beneath. Mrs. Callahan was in the garden when Elena arrived home, kneeling on a foam pad as she pruned the rose bushes. She looked up with a warm smile as Elena approached. "There you are, right on time. How was your day?" "Fine," Elena said, the lie coming automatically now. "I have homework. I'll be upstairs." In her room, Elena locked the door, something she rarely did, and pulled out the photograph from her nightstand drawer where she'd hidden it that morning. She sat on her bed comparing the face in the image to the face she'd seen on the computer screen. They were the same person, separated by years and circumstances she could barely comprehend. Michael Viscari was her father, a man accused of terrible things, a man who had given her away as a baby, a man who was currently on trial just a short distance from where she sat. And she had been living all this time hidden under a false name in a quiet suburb, while he faced the consequences of a life she knew nothing about. The sealed envelope she'd found in the attic sat in her desk drawer, unopened. For Elena, when she's old enough. How old was old enough? 8? 18? Would Mrs. Callahan ever have given it to her? Or would it have remained in that box forever gathering dust while Elena lived a life built on carefully maintained lies? With shaking hands, Elena broke the seal and pulled out the letter inside. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to the truth, or at least the beginning of it. I don't know how old you are now. Perhaps 8, perhaps 18. I don't know if I'm still alive to explain this to you myself, or if these words are all I'll ever be able to give you. Your father and I made the hardest decision of our lives when we chose to place you with Mrs. Callahan. We didn't abandon you, though I know it might feel that way. We loved you. I loved you. More than I can express in words. But the world your father and I inhabited was not safe for a child. It was not the world we wanted for you. I was sick when you were born, Elena. Very sick. And your father's life, his choices, had created a situation where you would never be free. If you stayed with us, you would have been a target, a tool for people to use against him. You would have grown up in shadow and fear, always looking over your shoulder, never able to trust anyone. So we chose differently. We chose to let you have a normal life, with a woman we trusted to love you and raise you well. Mrs. Callahan is a good person, Elena. She has no connection to our world, which is exactly why we chose her. With her, you could be just a girl, with school and friends, and a future that belonged to you. I don't know what your father's fate will be. His choices have consequences, and he knows that. But whatever happens to him, know this. You were the one pure thing in our lives. You were hope. You were possibility. And we loved you enough to let you go. Be brave, my daughter. Be kind. Be honest. Be everything this world tried to prevent you from being. With all my love, your mother, Isabella. Tears streamed down Elena's face as she read the letter a second time, then a third. Her mother had been sick. The beautiful woman in the photograph had written these words knowing she might not live to see her daughter grow up. Had she survived? The letter gave no indication of when it had been written, only that it had been meant for a future that had now arrived. Elena wiped her eyes and looked again at the photograph. Isabella Viscari, her mother, who had given her up out of love. Michael Viscari, her father, whose choices had created a life too dangerous for a child. and Elena herself, caught between the truth of where she came from and the life she'd been given as a shield against that truth. The trial was happening now. Her father was in Chicago, just miles away, facing judgment for everything he'd done. And Elena was here, in Riverside, hidden under a name that wasn't hers, living a life built on necessary lies. Something crystallized in Elena's chest as she sat there with the letter in her hands and the necklace around her neck. A decision, frightening in its clarity. She had spent 8 years not knowing, not understanding. She had spent 8 years feeling like something was missing without knowing what it was. But now she knew. Now she had a name, a face, a story, incomplete though it was. And she had a choice. She could stay here in this safe suburban house with Mrs. Callahan and let the trial run its course without her. She could pretend she'd never found the box, never read the letter, never learned the truth. She could grow up as Elena Brooks and leave Elena Vescari buried in the past where she'd been placed for her own protection. Or she could step forward. She could acknowledge what she'd learned. She could go to that courthouse where her father sat in judgment and let him know that she existed, that she had found out, that she wanted answers to all the questions burning inside her. The thought was terrifying. What would happen if she appeared? Would he even recognize her? Would he want to see her, or would her presence only cause more problems in a life already shattered by consequences? What about the people mentioned in the articles? The prosecutors, the lawyers, the others in his organization? Would they see her as a threat, as leverage, as something to be controlled or eliminated? But beneath the fear was something stronger, a fierce, burning need to know, to see him, to understand, to claim her identity, even if that identity was complicated and frightening and nothing like the simple life she'd been living. Elena spent the next week in a state of careful deception, acting normal around Mrs. Callahan while her mind churned with plans and possibilities. She returned to the library during lunch periods, learning everything she could about the trial. She discovered that it was being held at the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago, that it was open to the public, that anyone could attend if they passed through security. She also learned about the Vescari family crest, the eagle and shield she wore around her neck. It was a symbol known to anyone familiar with organized crime in the Midwest, a mark of allegiance and identity that went back generations. Wearing it meant something, claimed something. It was not jewelry to be worn casually. The more Elena learned, the more impossible her plan seemed. How would an 8-year-old girl get to downtown Chicago? How would she navigate a federal courthouse? How would she even know which courtroom to go to? And even if she managed all of that, what made her think anyone would take her seriously? That her presence would matter at all? But impossible or not, the plan took root in her mind and refused to let go. She began to prepare in small ways. She saved the allowance Mrs. Callahan gave her each week, $5 that usually went toward comic books or candy from the corner store. She studied bus routes on the computer at school, learning that the number 47 bus stopped 3 blocks from her house and ran directly to the transit center downtown, where she could transfer to the train that stopped near the Federal Building. She practiced leaving the house quietly in the early morning, before Mrs. Callahan woke, timing how long it took to walk to the bus stop. She packed a small backpack with essentials, the photograph of her parents, a granola bar, a water bottle, and the letter from her mother. And she wore the necklace every day, hidden beneath her shirts, feeling its weight as a reminder of who she really was beneath the carefully constructed fiction of Elena Brooks. 2 weeks after finding the box in the attic, Elena sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Callahan, pretending to do homework while the elderly woman worked on a crossword puzzle. The television in the living room was on, tuned to the local news as it was every evening. The Vescari trial entering its final days. The newsreader's voice drifted into the kitchen. Legal experts say a verdict could come as early as next week. The prosecution has rested its case, and the defense is expected to make closing arguments tomorrow. This trial, which has captivated the city for months, may finally be nearing its conclusion. Mrs. Callahan's pencil paused on her crossword. Elena glanced up and saw the elderly woman staring toward the living room with an expression of profound sadness. For a moment their eyes met, and Elena saw something there she'd never noticed before. Knowledge, understanding, grief. Mrs. Callahan knew. Of course she knew. She'd always known exactly who Elena was, who her parents were, what had happened. She'd spent 8 years carrying that knowledge, protecting Elena from it. And now, seeing the recognition in the child's eyes, she understood that the secret had been discovered. "Elena," Mrs. Callahan said softly, "we should talk." I found the box, Elena said, the words coming out in a rush. In the attic. I know my real name. I know who he is. I know everything. Mrs. Callahan set down her pencil with a trembling hand. I always knew this day would come. I hoped you'd be older, old enough to understand. I understand enough, Elena said, though she wasn't sure that was true. My mother wrote me a letter. She said you were a good person, that you were supposed to keep me safe. I tried, Mrs. Callahan whispered. I've tried every day for 8 years. Your mother, Isabella, she came to me when you were just days old. She was so sick, Elena, so weak, but she was determined to make sure you were protected. Your father couldn't be involved. There were people watching him, following him. If they'd known about you, known where you were. But he's on trial now, Elena said. Everyone knows about him. It's on the news every day, so why do I still have to hide? Mrs. Callahan closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were filled with tears. Because the danger doesn't end just because he's in custody. There are people who would still want to find you, to use you. People who see you as a way to hurt him or to gain leverage, or simply as a loose end that needs to be tied up. Your mother made me promise, made me swear, that I would keep you hidden, keep you safe no matter what happened to them. What did happen to her? Elena asked, needing to know but afraid of the answer. Is my mother still alive? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mrs. Callahan shook her head slowly. She passed when you were 3 months old. The illness, it took her quickly. She never got to see you grow up, never got to see the bright, beautiful girl you've become. The grief hit Elena like a wave, unexpected in its intensity. She had never known her mother, but somehow, reading that letter, seeing that photograph, she had begun to build a relationship with a ghost. And now, learning definitively that Isabella Viscari was gone, that there would never be a reunion, never be answers to the 1,000 questions Elena had, the loss felt devastatingly real. And my father? Elena managed to ask through her tears. He's alive, obviously, but he might as well be lost to you too. If he's convicted, when he's convicted, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. And even if you wanted to see him, to know him, it would put you at risk. There are people watching that trial, Elena. People who would notice if a little girl showed up claiming to be his daughter. People who wouldn't hesitate to. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Elena wiped her eyes, feeling something harden inside her chest. I want to see him. Before it's too late. Before the trial ends and he's gone forever. Elena, no, absolutely not. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It's not safe. It will never be safe. I don't care about safe, Elena said, and she was surprised by the strength in her own voice. I care about the truth. I care about knowing who I am. I've spent my whole life feeling like something was wrong, like I didn't fit, like there was some huge secret everyone knew except me. Well, now I know, and I can't just pretend I don't. Mrs. Callahan reached across the table and took both of Elena's hands in hers. Your mother gave up everything to keep you safe. She died knowing that you would have a chance at a normal life, away from all of this. If you walk into that courthouse, if you reveal yourself, you throw away everything she sacrificed for. Or maybe, Elena said quietly, I finally become who I'm supposed to be. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken over Riverside, Elena Brooks, who was also Elena Viscari, slipped out of her house with a small backpack and a heart full of determination that was equal parts courage and fear. She left a note on the kitchen table for Mrs. Callahan. I'm sorry, I have to do this. I'll be careful. I love you. The number 47 bus arrived at 6:45 a.m., nearly empty at this early hour. Elena climbed aboard, paid her fare with coins she'd been collecting, and took a seat near the back, watching through the window as Riverside, the only home she'd ever known, disappeared behind her. She touched the necklace hidden beneath her shirt, feeling the eagle and shield press against her skin. In a few hours, she would walk into a federal courthouse and change everything. She would step out of the shadows where she'd been hidden for her own protection and claim an identity that might destroy the fragile safety she'd always known. But for the first time in her 8 years of life, Elena felt like she was moving toward something true, something real, something that belonged to her and her alone. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences followed, she would finally stop being a girl who didn't belong and become exactly who she was meant to be. The bus rolled through the awakening city as the sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. And Elena Viscari rode toward her father's trial, toward revelation and danger and truth, wearing his family crest over her heart like armor. The Dirksen Federal Building rose from downtown Chicago like a monument to authority, its dark glass and steel exterior reflecting the gray October sky. Elena stood across the street, her small figure dwarfed by the surrounding skyscrapers, her backpack hanging from one shoulder as she stared up at the imposing structure. The morning rush of professionals streamed past her, lawyers in expensive suits, business people clutching coffee cups, government workers with identification badges clipped to their lapels. No one gave the small girl a second glance, just another face in the endless flow of the city. The journey here had taken nearly 2 hours. The bus ride from Riverside to the transit center, then the train that rattled through tunnels beneath the city, depositing her at Jackson Station just 3 blocks from the courthouse. Elena had never been to downtown Chicago before. Mrs. Callahan rarely ventured into the city, preferring the familiar comfort of their quiet suburb. The noise and movement and sheer scale of everything was overwhelming. Car horns blaring, construction equipment grinding, thousands of conversations creating a constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath her feet. But Elena hadn't come this far to turn back now. She crossed the street when the light changed, joining a group of people heading toward the building's main entrance. Security barriers and metal detectors were visible through the glass doors, along with federal officers in uniform scanning everyone who entered. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She had researched court security online at the school library, knew that she would have to pass through screening, knew that her backpack would be searched. She'd left anything potentially problematic at home. Scissors, anything sharp, even her house key. The only items in her bag were the photograph of her parents, her mother's letter, a granola bar and a water bottle, and around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt and jacket, was the Vescari family crest. The security line moved slowly. Elena stood behind a woman in a business suit who was arguing on her cell phone about a deposition, and in front of 2 men in expensive overcoats who were discussing legal strategy in low voices. No one seemed to notice that she was alone, that she was a child navigating an adult world without supervision. Perhaps they assumed she was with someone, that her parent or guardian was simply somewhere else in the crowd. When she reached the metal detector, a security officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying temples, looked down at her with mild surprise. "You here with someone, sweetheart?" Elena had practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. "Yes, sir. My aunt is already inside. She's a lawyer. She told me to meet her at the courtroom." The lie came out smoothly, more smoothly than she'd expected. The officer studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the metal detector. "All right, put your bag on the conveyor belt and walk through." The metal detector didn't beep. Her backpack passed inspection without issue. Within minutes, Elena was through security and standing in the building's vast lobby, a cavernous space with marble floors and soaring ceilings. A directory on the wall listed courtrooms by floor and number. She'd memorized the information from news articles. United States versus Michael Vescari. Courtroom 2506, 25th floor. The elevator ride up seemed to take forever, the numbers climbing slowly as her stomach dropped with each ascending floor. When the doors finally opened on the 25th floor, Elena stepped out into a corridor that was both institutional and intimidating. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, the floors covered in austere carpet. Signs directed visitors to various courtrooms, and small clusters of people stood in hushed conversation. More lawyers, witnesses, family members of defendants, all part of the machinery of federal justice. Courtroom 2506 was at the end of the hallway. Heavy wooden doors stood closed with a small window set at adult eye level, too high for Elena to see through. A bailiff stood nearby, a woman in uniform with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Elena approached slowly, uncertainty flooding through her for the first time since leaving Riverside that morning. What was she doing here? What made her think this would work, that anyone would care about a child showing up claiming to be connected to one of the most significant trials in years? She was 8 years old. She had no proof beyond a necklace and a photograph and a letter that could have been written by anyone. But then she touched the crest beneath her shirt, felt its solid weight, and remembered her mother's words. "Be brave, my daughter." "Excuse me," Elena said to the bailiff, her voice smaller than she would have liked. "Is this where the Vescari trial is happening?" The bailiff looked down at her with an expression that was professional but not unkind. "It is. But this is a restricted proceeding, honey. Are you here with family? Do you have someone who can—" "I am family," Elena interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I'm his daughter. I'm Elena Viscari. The bailiff's expression shifted from mild concern to sharp attention. Her eyes narrowed, scanning Elena's face as if searching for truth in her features. That's quite a claim, young lady. Do you have any identification? Anyone who can verify? Elena reached into her shirt and pulled out the necklace, letting the gold crest catch the fluorescent light of the hallway. The bailiff's breath caught audibly. The eagle and shield, the intricate metalwork, the unmistakable symbol of the Viscari family. It was not something a random child would possess. Where did you get that? The bailiff asked, her voice tight. It was my mother's, Isabella Viscari. She left it for me before she died. The hallway seemed to grow quieter, though Elena knew that was impossible. The bailiff stared at the necklace, then at Elena's face, clearly wrestling with a decision that was well above her pay grade. Finally, she spoke into a radio clipped to her shoulder. I need a supervisor to courtroom 2506 immediately. We have a situation. Within minutes, 3 people had materialized in the hallway. Another bailiff, a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as a courthouse administrator, and a man with federal marshal credentials. They ushered Elena away from the courtroom doors to a small side office, their expressions grave and uncertain. Sweetheart, I need you to explain to me how you got here and why you're claiming to be Michael Viscari's daughter, the administrator said, her voice firm, but not unkind. This is a very serious trial, and we can't have disruptions or false claims. Elena sat in a chair that was too large for her, her feet dangling above the floor. She pulled out her backpack and removed the photograph, the letter, and the copy of her birth certificate she'd taken from the attic box. She laid them on the desk like evidence in her own trial. My name is Elena Viscari, she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. I was born 8 years ago. My mother was Isabella Viscari, and my father is Michael Viscari. I was given to a woman named Mrs. Callahan when I was a baby to keep me safe. I've been living in Riverside under the name Elena Brooks, but that's not who I really am, and I have a right to be here. I have a right to see my father. The administrator picked up the birth certificate, examining it carefully. She looked at the photograph, then at Elena, then back at the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. Elena had her father's dark eyes, the same shape of face, features that were clearly inherited. Wait here, the administrator said finally. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. This needs to be verified. The next hour was a blur of waiting and questions. Elena sat in the small office while people came and went, making phone calls, taking photographs of her documents, speaking in hushed tones just outside the door. She could feel their uncertainty, their concern, their scrambling to figure out what to do with this unexpected complication. Finally, the administrator returned with 2 men Elena recognized from news photographs. The first was Marcus Chen, the lead federal prosecutor, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the demeanor of someone who had spent decades building cases. The second was David Goldman, Michael Viscari's defense attorney, younger, perhaps 40, with expensive clothes and an expression of barely controlled shock. Ms. Brooks, or Ms. Viscari, the prosecutor began, his voice carefully neutral. Do you understand the seriousness of what you're claiming? I'm not claiming anything, Elena said quietly. I'm telling the truth. Michael Viscari is my father. Isabella Viscari was my mother. I know I was hidden. I know it was supposed to be a secret, but I found out, and I came here because he's my father, and this might be my only chance to ever see him. Goldman, the defense attorney, leaned forward, his eyes intense. How long have you known about this? Who told you to come here? Are you working with someone? No one told me to come. I found things in my guardian's attic, documents, photos, a letter from my mother. I came here by myself. I took the bus and the train. No one knows I'm here except Mrs. Callahan, and she tried to stop me. The 2 lawyers exchanged glances loaded with implications Elena couldn't fully read. The prosecutor spoke first. If what you're saying is true, and I'm not yet convinced that it is, your presence here could significantly complicate these proceedings. The defense might try to use you to gain sympathy, to humanize their client. And if what she's saying is true, Goldman countered sharply, then she has every right to be here. She's his daughter. Are you really going to bar a child from seeing her father, prosecutor? I'm going to ensure the integrity of this trial, Chen replied, which means verifying her claims before we make any decisions. The crest alone is verification, Goldman argued. Look at her. Look at the photograph. She has his eyes, his features. Run a DNA test if you want absolute proof, but we both know what the result will be. Elena watched this exchange like a tennis match, her fate being debated by strangers who saw her as a problem to be solved, rather than a person with her own needs and rights. Finally, she spoke up, her voice cutting through their argument. I don't want to complicate anything. I don't want to be used by anyone. I just want to see him. Just once. Is that really so much to ask? Both men fell silent. The administrator shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Chen sighed deeply. I need to speak with the judge. This is unprecedented. Goldman, I assume you want your client informed? Immediately. The defense attorney confirmed. They left Elena alone again, the wait stretching into another 30 minutes that felt like hours. She ate her granola bar, drank some water, and stared at the photograph of her parents, wondering what her father would think when he learned she existed, that she'd found him, that she was here. Would he be angry? Afraid for her safety? Would he deny her to protect her, claim she was lying or confused? Or would he acknowledge her, claim her, admit to the world that yes, he had a daughter, and she was standing in this courthouse wearing his family's crest? The door opened again. This time it was Goldman alone, and his expression was complex. Satisfaction mixed with concern, triumph shadowed by worry. The judge has agreed to a brief recess. Your father wants to see you. But Elena, you need to understand something before we go in there. She looked up at him, waiting. Michael Vescari is not a regular father. He's a man facing charges that could put him away for the rest of his life. He has spent decades building walls around himself, protecting himself from vulnerability. The fact that you exist, that you're here, it could break something in him that he's worked very hard to keep intact. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for him to potentially be someone different from what you've imagined? Elena thought about this carefully. I'm not expecting anything. I don't know him. I need to see him. I need him to know that I'm real, that I found out, that I exist. Goldman nodded slowly. All right, come with me. But remember, there will be guards present. You won't be able to touch him or get too close. This is a controlled meeting in a federal facility. Understand? I understand. They walked back down the corridor, but instead of entering the courtroom, Goldman led her to a different door marked Conference Room B. 2 federal marshals stood outside, their expressions unreadable. Goldman spoke briefly with them, then opened the door and gestured for Elena to enter. The room was small and windowless, with a table in the center and chairs on either side. And sitting in one of those chairs, his hands folded on the table in front of him, wearing a dark suit that somehow maintained its dignity despite the circumstances, was Michael Vescari. Elena had studied his face in photographs and news footage, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of his presence. He was imposing even while seated, with a bearing that suggested authority even in confinement. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, his face lined with the weight of years and choices. But his eyes were exactly like hers, dark and intense, and in them she saw a storm of emotions that took her breath away. Shock, recognition, pain, fear, and beneath it all, something that might have been wonder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other across the small room, father and daughter separated by 8 years of absence and a table that might as well have been an ocean. Finally, Michael Vescari's voice broke the silence. Rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. Isabella, she died when I was 3 months old, Elena said quietly. Mrs. Callahan told me. I'm sorry. He closed his eyes, his jaw clenching as he absorbed this confirmation of something he must have suspected but never known for certain. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. You look like her. You have my eyes, but everything else. You're her daughter. I'm your daughter too, Elena said, and she was surprised by the defiance in her own voice. Whether you want me to be or not. Want you? Michael's voice cracked. Elena, I have spent 8 years not knowing if you were alive or dead, if Isabella succeeded in hiding you, or if something had happened. I couldn't look for you. I couldn't ask. Any inquiry, any attempt to find you would have put you in immediate danger. So I existed in this limbo, this not knowing, hoping that silence meant safety. She left me a letter, Elena said. Mom did. She explained why she gave me away. She said you were trying to protect me. We were. We did. Michael leaned forward slightly, as much as the marshal standing by the door would allow. Elena, you shouldn't have come here. This courthouse, this trial, there are people watching, people who would see you as leverage or as a threat. By coming here, by revealing yourself, I know, Elena interrupted. Mrs. Callahan told me. She said there were dangerous people who would want to find me. But you know what? I don't care. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being Elena Brooks when I'm really Elena Viscari. I'm tired of living a lie to protect myself from a truth I didn't even know about. Michael stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. Pride, perhaps, or recognition of something in her that reflected himself. The same stubborn refusal to back down, the same determination to face consequences rather than hide from them. You have her courage, he said softly. Isabella was brave in ways I never could be. She faced her illness with dignity. She made impossible choices to protect you, and you're just like her. Tell me about her, Elena said, the request coming out as almost a plea. Please. I only have one photograph and one letter. I want to know who she was. Michael's expression softened, memory temporarily overriding the harsh reality of their surroundings. She was beautiful, not just physically, though she was that too, but beautiful in the way she saw the world, in her capacity for kindness even when kindness wasn't deserved. She was a teacher before she met me. Elementary school. She loved children, loved helping them learn and grow. What happened to her? The illness, what was it? The pain that crossed Michael's face was visceral. Cancer. Aggressive. It was already advanced when you were born. She had maybe 6 months, the doctor said. She used that time to make arrangements for you, to find Mrs. Callahan, to write letters and create a plan that would keep you safe. She died knowing you would have a chance at the life she wanted for you. A normal life, away from all this. But I don't want normal if normal means not knowing who I am, Elena said. I want truth, even if truth is complicated. Goldman shifted near the door, checking his watch. We have maybe 5 more minutes before the judge expects us back in court. Michael, we need to discuss how we're going to handle this. Michael's attention snapped to his lawyer. Handle this? We're not handling anything. Elena is going to leave this building, return to Mrs. Callahan, and continue living her life as Elena Brooks. This meeting never happened. I'm not leaving, Elena said firmly. I came here to see you, and I'm going to stay and see what happens. I want to know the truth about everything. About you, about the trial, about why everyone is so afraid. Elena, listen to me. Michael's voice carried the weight of command, the same tone that had probably bent many stronger people to his will. This is not a game. This is not an adventure. This is reality. And reality for people connected to me is dangerous. I made choices, terrible choices that have consequences. Those consequences are mine to bear, not yours. But they are mine to bear, Elena countered. Because those choices made me who I am. They're why I was hidden. They're why my mother is dead. They're why I've spent 8 years feeling like something was missing. So yes, they're your consequences, but they're my reality. The marshal near the door spoke up. Time's up. We need to return to the courtroom. Michael stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Goldman, I need you to arrange protection for her. Immediately. I don't care what it costs or what strings you have to pull. And I need you to contact Mrs. Callahan. Make sure she knows Elena is safe. I can contact Mrs. Callahan myself, Elena said, pulling a small flip phone from her backpack. A basic emergency phone Mrs. Callahan had given her years ago that she'd charged the night before. I left her a note. I'll call her. Michael looked at the phone, then at his daughter, and something like admiration crossed his face. You planned this. You thought it through. I'm not stupid, Elena said. I'm 8, not helpless. No, Michael agreed softly. You're definitely not helpless, you're a Viscari. Goldman cleared his throat. Michael, we really need to discuss how we're addressing this in court. The prosecution already knows. The judge knows. We can't pretend this didn't happen. Then we don't pretend, Michael said, his voice hardening into decision. If Elena is determined to be here, to be known, then we acknowledge it. We tell the truth. Yes, I have a daughter. Yes, she was hidden for her protection. Yes, I made choices to keep her safe from the life I created. Let the prosecution make of that what they will. The defense attorney looked uncertain. That's a risky strategy. It could backfire. The prosecution might argue that even your family relationships were manipulative, strategic. Or, Michael interrupted, the jury might see that even someone like me loved enough to make sacrifices, that even in the worst of lives, there are moments of trying to do right. Either way, I won't deny her. Not now. Not after she's been brave enough to come here. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest. Validation, recognition, a sense of being claimed that she'd never experienced before. Whatever else Michael Viscari was, whatever he'd done, in this moment he was a father acknowledging his daughter. Can I stay? She asked. In the courtroom, Can I watch? Michael looked to Goldman, who looked to the marshal, who shrugged. That's up to the judge, the marshal said. But given the circumstances, I imagine allowances might be made. They returned to the hallway, where a small crowd had gathered. The prosecutor Chen, several other lawyers, courthouse staff, all of them clearly aware that something unprecedented was unfolding. Elena walked beside Goldman, with Michael following behind, flanked by marshals, and she felt the weight of every stare, every whisper. She touched the crest at her neck, drawing strength from its solidity. The courtroom itself was larger than Elena had imagined, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches like church pews. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated and imposing. A jury box sat to one side, filled with 12 people who were now staring at Elena with undisguised curiosity. Judge Catherine Morrison was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She looked at Elena for a long moment before speaking. "Young lady, I understand you've made quite the entrance to these proceedings. Before we continue, I need to establish a few things. First, what is your name?" Elena stood in the aisle, her voice clear. "Elena Viscari, Your Honor, though I've been living as Elena Brooks." "And you claim to be the daughter of the defendant, Michael Viscari?" "I am his daughter, Your Honor. Not just claiming. I have documentation, my birth certificate, a letter from my mother, and this." She pulled the crest from beneath her shirt, letting it catch the courtroom lights. A murmur ran through the room. Several people in the gallery leaned forward for a better look. The jury members exchanged glances loaded with significance. Judge Morrison studied Elena with an expression that was impossible to read. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Viscari, does the defense confirm this young lady's identity?" Michael stood, his lawyer beside him. "Yes, Your Honor, this is my daughter. She was born to my late wife, Isabella, and was placed in protective custody as an infant for her safety. I have not seen her since she was days old." The judge turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Chen, do you dispute this claim?" The prosecutor stood slowly. We are still verifying the details, Your Honor, but the preliminary evidence suggests her claim is legitimate. However, I must express concern about potential manipulation of the proceedings. The defense may be attempting to use the child's presence to influence the jury, to create sympathy. Your Honor, Goldman interrupted, my client had no knowledge that his daughter would appear today. He did not orchestrate this. She came of her own volition, having discovered her true identity independently. To suggest otherwise is to imply a level of control and manipulation that simply doesn't exist in this situation. Judge Morrison held up a hand for silence. I will not have this trial turned into a circus, regardless of the emotional impact of these revelations. However, I also recognize that Ms. Viscari has a right to be present in a public proceeding, particularly one that directly concerns her father. Therefore, she may remain in the courtroom, seated in the gallery, observing only. She is not to be called as a witness by either side. She is not to be photographed or approached by media, and she is to be treated with the protection and dignity owed to any child in this building. Is that clear? Both lawyers nodded. Elena was directed to a seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind where her father sat with his legal team. A victim's advocate, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Martinez, sat beside her, explaining in quiet tones that she was there to help, to answer questions, to make sure Elena was all right. The trial resumed, but everything had changed. The lawyers' arguments carried different weight now, delivered in the presence of a child whose very existence contradicted certain narratives and complicated others. The jury members' eyes kept drifting to Elena, taking in her small figure, her serious expression, the gold crest visible against her shirt. During breaks, reporters clamored outside the courtroom, held back by security. The story had already leaked. Mob boss's secret daughter appears at trial. Elena could hear their shouted questions, see their cameras, feel the weight of public attention settling onto her shoulders. Mrs. Callahan called the emergency phone within an hour, her voice tight with worry and fear. Elena, sweetheart, what have you done? Where are you? Are you safe? I'm in the courthouse, Elena said quietly, stepping into a side hallway for privacy. I saw him, Mrs. Callahan. I met my father, and he acknowledged me. He told them I'm his daughter. The elderly woman's sob carried clearly through the phone. Oh, Elena, do you understand what you've done? You've stepped out of the shadows. You've made yourself visible to everyone who might want to hurt you. I know, Elena said, but I couldn't keep hiding. I couldn't keep being someone I'm not. I needed him to know I exist. I needed to know him. I'm coming to get you, Mrs. Callahan said. Stay where you are. Don't leave that building. I'm calling a car service right now. There are federal marshals here, Elena assured her, and a victim's advocate. They're keeping me safe. Just, please don't be angry. I had to do this. A long silence then. I'm not angry, sweetheart. I'm terrified, but I understand. Your mother was the same way, brave to the point of foolishness, determined to face truth even when lies would be safer. I'll be there in an hour. Please. Please be careful. The afternoon session continued with Elena watching every moment. Her father sat with rigid posture, occasionally glancing back at her with an expression that mixed pride and worry. Goldman adjusted his strategy on the fly, incorporating subtle references to family, to sacrifice, to the complicated nature of love and protection. The prosecution, caught off guard, struggled to regain their footing. Their carefully constructed narrative of Michael Viscari as a ruthless operator suddenly had to account for a hidden daughter, for a dying wife, for choices made in the name of protection. When court finally adjourned for the day, Judge Morrison called both legal teams to her chambers, along with Elena and the victim's advocate. The discussion that followed was tense and complex. Questions of safety, of media management, of how to proceed with a trial that had been irrevocably altered by a child's courage. Ms. Viscari, the judge addressed Elena directly. Do you understand that your presence here has created complications? That people will now be very interested in you, in your story, in your relationship with your father? Yes, Your Honor, Elena said. And are you prepared for that? For the attention, the questions, the potential danger? Elena thought about this carefully before answering. I don't know if anyone can really be prepared for something like that, but I'm not sorry I came. I'm not sorry I found out the truth. Whatever happens now, at least I know who I am. Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're a remarkable young lady. I'm going to order protective measures for you. Security detail, media restrictions, the works. You will not be harassed or exploited. Is that understood, counsel? Both Goldman and Chen agreed immediately. As they left the courthouse an hour later, Elena flanked by federal marshals, Goldman running interference with reporters, Mrs. Callahan arriving in a hired car with tears streaming down her face, Elena looked back at the building one final time. Somewhere inside, her father was being returned to custody, facing an uncertain future but no longer alone in his burden. He had a daughter. The world knew it now. And Elena Viscari, who had spent 8 years living as someone else, had finally stepped into the truth of who she was, wearing her family's crest for all to see. The car pulled away from the curb, taking her back to Riverside, back to the small house with the sagging porch and overgrown roses. But Elena knew that everything had changed. She had walked into that courtroom a hidden child, a secret protected at all costs. She was leaving as something entirely different, a known quantity, a Viscari in name and in fact a girl who had chosen truth over safety and would now have to live with all the consequences that choice entailed. As Chicago's skyline receded behind them, Elena touched the crest at her neck and whispered a promise to the mother she'd never known. I was brave. And in the silence of the car, with Mrs. Callahan's hand gripping hers and the weight of the future pressing down on her small shoulders, Elena Viscari felt something she'd never experienced before, the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of being exactly who she was meant to be, for better or for worse, come what may. The safe house was nothing like Elena had imagined. She'd pictured something dark and secretive, hidden in shadowy alleys like the places she'd seen in movies. Instead, it was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood called Lincoln Park, with a small front lawn and cheerful yellow shutters that seemed designed to blend seamlessly into suburban normalcy. But the illusion of normalcy ended at the front door, where 2 federal agents stood guard in plain clothes, their eyes constantly scanning the street. Inside, more agents occupied the living room, their presence transforming the comfortable space into something that felt more like a command center than a home. It had been 48 hours since Elena's appearance at the courthouse, and the world had erupted around her in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. The story had spread like wildfire. News websites, television broadcasts, social media platforms all buzzing with the revelation. Michael Viscari, the feared figure on trial for leading an organization, had a secret daughter who had appeared wearing his family crest. Elena sat at the kitchen table, a mug of hot chocolate growing cold in front of her, while Special Agent Maria Santos explained the situation with patient thoroughness. Santos was a woman in her early 40s with kind brown eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that suggested she'd seen everything and couldn't be easily rattled. "Elena, I need you to understand what's happening," Santos said, her voice gentle but serious. "When you revealed yourself at the trial, you became visible to a lot of people who have complicated feelings about your father. Some of those people want to protect you because they care about him. Others want to find you because they see you as leverage, a way to influence the trial's outcome or to gain advantage in other matters." Mrs. Callahan sat beside Elena, her weathered hand gripping the girl's smaller one. The elderly woman looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past 2 days, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "I told you this would happen," she whispered, though there was no accusation in her voice, only grief. "I know," Elena said quietly, "but I still would have done it. I still needed to see him." Santos nodded, understanding rather than judgment in her expression. "I get it, I do. But now we have to deal with the reality of the situation. Yesterday, 2 different groups tried to locate you. One was affiliated with your father's organization, loyalists who want to make sure you're safe. The other," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the other represents people who have been harmed by your father's actions and see you as a way to hurt him back." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, hurt him back?" "Not physically," Santos assured her quickly. "But in a trial like this, emotional leverage matters. If certain parties could control your whereabouts, they might try to use that information to influence your father's testimony or his legal strategy, make him more cooperative or less so depending on their goals. So I'm a bargaining chip," Elena said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "You're a complication," Santos corrected. "And in my experience, complications create opportunities for both protection and exploitation. That's why you're here, in a safe location with around-the-clock security. That's why we've restricted all media access to you. And that's why we need to be very careful about your movements until the trial concludes." Over the following days, Elena settled into an odd routine in the safe house. Mrs. Callahan had packed bags for both of them: clothes, books, Elena's schoolwork. A tutor arrived daily, a cheerful woman named Ms. Rodriguez, who helped Elena keep up with her 3rd-grade curriculum while pretending that studying multiplication tables in a federal safe house was perfectly normal. Agent Santos visited every afternoon, bringing updates on the trial and checking on Elena's well-being. She explained things in terms Elena could understand, translating the complex legal proceedings into language that made sense to an 8-year-old. "Your father's lawyers are using your existence as part of their closing argument," Santos explained on the 3rd day. "They're not putting you on the stand or exploiting you, we wouldn't allow that. But they're pointing out that even in his complicated life, your father made choices to protect someone vulnerable, to give you a chance at something better." "Is it working?" Elena asked. "Is the jury listening?" Santos smiled slightly. "Juries are unpredictable. But yes, your presence has had an impact. The prosecution has had to adjust their narrative. They can't paint your father as completely heartless when he clearly went to great lengths to keep you safe and hidden." Elena thought about this, turning it over in her mind. "So I am being used, just not directly." "The truth is being used," Santos corrected gently. "Your existence is a fact, Elena. How people interpret that fact, what meaning they assign to it, that's beyond your control. But you're not being exploited. You're being protected while the adults sort through complicated consequences." That night, unable to sleep, Elena sat by the window of her temporary bedroom and stared out at the quiet street below. A black SUV sat at the curb. More agents, keeping watch. Across the street she could see normal families going about their normal lives. A man walking his dog. A teenager shooting baskets in a driveway. A mother carrying groceries into her house. Elena pressed her hand against the window, feeling the cool glass against her palm. She'd wanted truth so badly, had been willing to sacrifice safety for it. But now, sitting in this protected space, separated from everything familiar, she wondered if she'd understood the real cost of that choice. "Elena?" Mrs. Callahan's voice came from the doorway, soft with concern. "Can't sleep, sweetheart. I keep thinking about what Agent Santos said, about the different groups trying to find me." Elena turned from the window. "Mrs. Callahan, did he really do all the things they say he did in the trial?" The elderly woman entered the room and sat on the bed, her movements slow and careful. "I don't know all the details, Elena. Your mother didn't tell me everything, probably to protect me as much as to protect you. But yes, I believe your father made choices that hurt people. built an organization that operated outside the law. He's not an innocent man. But he's still my father, Elena said, the words caught between question and statement. Yes, he is. And that's what makes this so complicated. Mrs. Callahan patted the bed beside her, and Elena climbed up, settling against the elderly woman's side like she had countless times over the years. People aren't simple, sweetheart. They're not all good or all bad. Your father did terrible things, but he also loved your mother enough to let her hide you. Those two truths exist together, whether we like it or not. I saw him look at me in the courthouse, Elena said quietly, when he first realized who I was. He looked scared and sad, and something else I couldn't name. Love, Mrs. Callahan said softly. That's what you saw. Love for a daughter he'd never known but had been trying to protect from the moment you were born. The next morning brought unexpected news. Goldman, Michael's attorney, arrived at the safe house with Agent Santos, both of them wearing expressions that suggested something significant had happened. Elena, your father wants to speak with you, Goldman said once they were all seated in the living room. Not in person, that's not possible given the circumstances, but via a secure video call. The judge has approved it, with supervision present. Would you be willing to do that? Elena's heart raced. Yes. When? This afternoon. 2 o'clock. But Elena, you need to understand that this conversation will be monitored. Anything said could potentially be used in the trial. Your father knows this, and he's willing to accept that risk. But you should be aware. At exactly 2 o'clock, Elena sat in front of a laptop computer set up on the kitchen table. Agent Santos sat beside her, while Mrs. Callahan stood behind her, one hand resting protectively on Elena's shoulder. Goldman was present via another video connection, as was a court stenographer who would record everything said. The screen flickered, and suddenly Michael Viscari's face appeared. He was in what looked like a small conference room, wearing the same type of suit he'd worn in court, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes betraying deep emotion. Elena, he said, his voice slightly distorted by the computer speakers. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Hi, Elena said, suddenly shy. How are you? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. That's a complicated question, but seeing you, even like this, makes things bearable. For a moment they simply looked at each other, father and daughter separated by distance and circumstance but connected by blood and something neither could fully articulate. I'm sorry, Michael said finally. For everything. For the choices I made that led to you having to be hidden. For the life you could have had if I'd been a different person. For the danger you're in now because you were brave enough to find me. Agent Santos says people are looking for me, Elena said, deciding to be direct. People who want to use me to affect your trial. Michael's jaw tightened. I know. I've heard. Elena, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There are people who were loyal to me for years, who I trusted, who now see opportunity in chaos. Vincent Romano is one of them. Agent Santos leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpening at the name. Vincent was my right hand, Michael continued. But the trial has created fractures in the organization. Some people want to protect what's left. Others want to dismantle it entirely. Vincent is caught in the middle and I don't know which way he'll fall. If he contacts you, if anyone claiming to represent me tries to reach you, I need you to tell Agent Santos immediately. Okay, Elena said. I will. The other concern is rivals. People who have been competing with my organization for years and see this trial as an opportunity to eliminate me permanently. They might try to use you as leverage to force me into certain admissions or testimonies. You need to stay exactly where you are with the protection the FBI is providing. I'm not going anywhere, Elena assured him. I have federal agents watching the house and everything. Michael's expression softened slightly. Good. That's good. I've spent 8 years not knowing if you were safe, and now that I finally know you exist, the thought of anything happening to you, he trailed off, emotion choking his words. Mr. Viscari, Agent Santos interjected gently. We're doing everything possible to ensure Elena's safety, but it would help if you could provide information about specific threats, names, locations, patterns of behavior that might indicate. I'll cooperate fully, Michael interrupted. Whatever you need to know to keep her protected, I'll tell you. Goldman has the details. The attorney's voice came through the speakers. We've prepared a comprehensive brief on potential threat actors. It'll be delivered to the FBI within the hour. Elena watched her father's face on the screen, seeing the internal struggle play out in his expression. This was a man who had built his life on secrecy and control, now voluntarily offering information to federal agents because his daughter's safety outweighed everything else. "Elena," Michael said, his attention returning to her, "there's something else I need to tell you. The verdict is expected any day now. Regardless of the outcome, I want you to know that meeting you, seeing you, knowing that you're real and alive and brave, it's given me something I didn't think I'd ever have. Peace, maybe. Or at least the understanding that something good came from my life despite everything else." "What if they find you guilty?" Elena asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice. "They will find me guilty," Michael said with absolute certainty. "The evidence is overwhelming. I'll spend the rest of my life in prison, Elena. That's the reality we're facing." Tears pricked Elena's eyes. "So I found you just to lose you?" "No, sweetheart. You found me so that I could tell you the truth, so that you could know where you came from and understand that you have a choice about where you go from here. You don't have to be defined by my mistakes. Your mother made sure of that when she placed you with Mrs. Callahan. You get to be whoever you choose to be." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Michael asking about her life, her school, her interests. Elena told him about her love of reading, her struggles with mathematics, her friendship with a girl named Sophie who didn't care that Elena was usually quiet and serious. When the call finally ended, Elena sat back in her chair, feeling emotionally exhausted. Mrs. Callahan wrapped her in a hug while Agent Santos quietly made notes on a tablet. "He really loves you," Mrs. Callahan whispered into Elena's hair. That was clear in every word. "I know," Elena said, "but it doesn't change anything, does it? He's still going to prison. I'm still going to be the daughter of someone who did terrible things, and people are still going to be interested in me for all the wrong reasons." Agent Santos looked up from her tablet. "Elena, I want you to understand something. Yes, your father will likely be convicted. Yes, his reputation will follow you in certain ways. But you're also 8 years old with your whole life ahead of you. The choices you make from this point forward will define you far more than the circumstances of your birth. I've seen it happen dozens of times. Children of complicated parents who grow up to be remarkable people in their own right." That evening, as Elena prepared for bed in the safe house, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at her reflection. She saw her father's eyes looking back at her, her mother's features in the shape of her face. She touched the Viscari crest that still hung around her neck, feeling its familiar weight. She had wanted truth. She had wanted to know who she was, where she came from, why she'd always felt like something was missing. And now she knew. Now she carried that knowledge like she carried the necklace, as both a burden and a gift, a complication and a clarity. Outside, federal agents kept watch over a girl who had stepped out of shadows and into a spotlight she hadn't fully understood. Inside, Elena Viscari climbed into bed in a house that wasn't her home, protected by strangers, connected to a father she barely knew but couldn't help loving. And somewhere in Chicago, in a federal detention facility, Michael Viscari lay in his cell knowing that for the first time in 8 years, his daughter was real to him, alive and protected, and that was worth every consequence he would face when the verdict came down. The safe house settled into quiet as night deepened, but Elena lay awake, thinking about choices and consequences, about fathers and daughters, about the complicated truth that had replaced her simple lies, and wondering what would come next in a story that was still unfolding. The courtroom was packed on the final day, every seat filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the trial from its first moments. Elena sat in her usual place in the front row, Agent Santos beside her, Mrs. Callahan's hand gripping hers tightly. Judge Morrison entered, and the familiar call of "all rise" echoed through the space. Elena's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. After 2 weeks of deliberation, the jury had reached a verdict. Michael sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. But when he glanced back at Elena, she saw the fear he was trying to hide. Not fear for himself, but fear of what this moment would mean for her, for the fragile connection they'd built in such a short time. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with gray hair, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The next minutes unfolded like a slow-motion sequence. The foreman read through the charges, and after each one, the same word: guilty. Elena watched her father's shoulders sag slightly with each repetition, the weight of consequences settling onto him like a physical burden. Goldman placed a hand on Michael's arm, offering silent support. The prosecutors sat stone-faced, their victory complete but somehow hollow in the presence of the small girl in the front row. When the final count was read, Judge Morrison set a sentencing date for 3 weeks hence. "The defendant will remain in custody until that time," she declared. Then with a glance at Elena, she added, "I'm ordering a brief recess before we adjourn. Defense, if you need a moment with your client and his family, now would be the time." Goldman worked quickly, and within minutes, Elena was escorted to the same conference room where she'd first met her father. This time, the meeting carried a different weight, finality replacing possibility. Michael's eyes were red-rimmed when Elena entered, though he was fighting to maintain composure. "You shouldn't have had to see that," he said quietly. "I wanted to be here," Elena replied, moving closer despite the marshal's presence. "I needed to be here. The sentencing will be severe," Michael said, his voice rough. "Likely life imprisonment. Elena, I need you to understand something. This is where our story together ends, at least in any conventional sense. I'll be transferred to a federal facility, probably far from Chicago. Visits will be restricted and complicated. You'll be a child growing up with a father in prison." "I know," Elena said, tears streaming down her face. "But you're still my father. That doesn't change just because you're going away." Michael's careful control finally broke, and tears spilled down his cheeks. "You're extraordinary, Elena. Your mother would be so proud of the person you're becoming. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be." "You do have the right," Elena insisted. "You're my dad. That gives you the right." They talked for 20 minutes about the future, about Elena's education, about Mrs. Callahan's continued guardianship, about Michael's instructions to Vincent Romano to establish a trust fund for Elena's care and schooling. Michael had made arrangements, even from custody, to ensure his daughter would want for nothing material, even as she grew up without him. "I wrote you a letter," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his lawyer's briefcase. "For when you're older, 16 maybe, when you can better understand the complexity of the choices I made and the life I led. Goldman will hold it until then." Elena took the envelope, adding it to the letter from her mother that she still carried with her. 2 letters, 2 parents, both trying to explain themselves across time and circumstance. When the marshal indicated their time was up, Michael stood and faced his daughter one last time. "Be brave, Elena. Be honest. Be better than I was. Live the life your mother and I dreamed you could have." "I will," Elena promised. "And I'll write to you. If they let me, I'll visit. You won't be alone in there, Dad. I won't let you be alone." The word "Dad" broke something in Michael, and for a moment, the powerful figure who had commanded so much fear and respect was simply a father saying goodbye to his child. "I love you, Elena. I've loved you from the moment I knew you existed. Never doubt that. I love you too," Elena whispered. The weeks that followed the verdict were a whirlwind of adjustment and change. The media attention gradually faded as new stories captured public interest. Elena returned to the house in Riverside, to her small bedroom, and Mrs. Callahan's gentle care, but everything felt different now. She was no longer Elena Brooks, the quiet girl who didn't quite fit. She was Elena Viscari, daughter of Michael Viscari, connected to a legacy of complexity and consequence. Some of her classmates' parents withdrew their children from playdates. Others looked at her with a mixture of pity and fascination. But there were bright spots too. Sophie remained her friend, declaring that she didn't care who Elena's father was. Miss Patterson, her teacher, treated her with the same kindness as always, and Agent Santos stayed in contact, checking in regularly, offering support as Elena navigated her new reality. Vincent Romano visited the house one afternoon, 3 weeks after the sentencing hearing where Michael had received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The man was tall and imposing, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. But when he looked at Elena, his expression softened. "Your father asked me to look after you," Vincent said, sitting in Mrs. Callahan's living room with the awkwardness of someone unused to domestic settings, "to make sure you have what you need. The trust fund is established, your education, your future, it's all secured." "Thank you," Elena said quietly, "but I don't need money as much as I need to understand. Who was my father, really? Not the news stories or the trial testimony. Who was he as a person?" Vincent considered this carefully. He was complicated, capable of great loyalty and great ruthlessness. He built an empire through intelligence and determination, but also through choices that harmed people. Yet when your mother got sick, I watched him transform. He became desperate to give her peace to ensure you would be safe. That's when I saw the man he might have been if he'd made different choices earlier in life. Do you regret working with him? Elena asked. Every day, Vincent admitted. But I also can't undo the past. All I can do is try to make better choices going forward, like ensuring his daughter has the opportunities he wanted for her. Over the following year, Elena's life found a new equilibrium. She wrote letters to her father weekly, and he responded with thoughtful replies that taught her about resilience, about accepting consequences, about finding meaning even in confinement. She visited him twice, difficult journeys to a federal facility downstate, where they spoke through glass partitions and built a relationship constructed from fragments and determination. Mrs. Callahan's health began to decline, and Elena found herself caring for the woman who had raised her, their roles gently reversing. Vincent checked in regularly, became an unlikely guardian figure, his own redemption tied to protecting Michael's daughter. Elena threw herself into her studies, determined to prove that her father's choices didn't define her future. She excelled in school, made genuine friendships, and began to understand that identity was something you built through your own actions, not something you inherited. On her 16th birthday, Goldman delivered 2 letters as promised. The one from her father written after the verdict and another from Vincent containing information about her mother's family, connections Elena had never known existed. She read them both in her room, now decorated with photos of both families, the Vescaries and the Callahans, the complicated and the simple, the truth and the protection. The letters offered wisdom, apology, hope, and the acknowledgement that life rarely provided clean narratives or simple answers. Elena stood at her window, looking out at Riverside's familiar streets, wearing the Vescary crest she'd never taken off. She was no longer the 8-year-old girl who had walked into a courtroom seeking truth. She was 16, poised between childhood and adulthood, carrying the weight of her history while building her own future. She had a father in prison who loved her despite his failures. She had Mrs. Callahan, growing frailer but still devoted. She had Vincent, finding redemption through protection. She had friends who knew her story and chose her anyway. And she had herself, Elena Vescari, who had chosen courage over safety, truth over comfort, and in doing so had claimed an identity that was entirely her own. The past had shaped her, but it would not define her. The future was unwritten, full of possibility and choice. And Elena, standing at her window with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, understood that her story, the real story, was just beginning. She was her father's daughter. She was her mother's legacy. But most importantly, she was Elena Vescari, and that meant exactly what she chose it to mean. The Vescary crest caught the light as she touched it, a reminder of where she came from. But the diploma on her desk, the college acceptance letters that would arrive in 2 years, the dreams she harbored of studying law or social work or something that would help others navigate the complicated intersections of justice and mercy, those were reminders of where she was going. And in a federal facility 300 miles away, Michael Vescari received his daughter's latest letter, and for the first time in decades, felt something like peace. He had failed at so much, had caused so much harm, but in Elena, in her courage and her compassion and her determination to be better than her circumstances, he had somehow contributed to something genuinely good. It wasn't redemption. He was too wise to believe in easy absolution, but it was meaning. It was hope. It was the knowledge that even in the darkest of legacies, light could emerge if given the chance. Elena Vescari had walked into a trial wearing her family's crest and walked out carrying its weight. Now she would spend the rest of her life deciding what that weight would build, burden or foundation, anchor or wings. She chose wings.